Welcome back to our channel. Today, we are going to tell the story of a face that, for a brief incandescent moment, defined a new kind of cool. A face that stared out from the pages of Vogue and from the silver screen with a look of raw, rebellious poetry. He was a Calvin Klein model, an indie film darling, a brother in arms to River Phoenix and Keanu Reeves. He was poised to conquer the world. And then he vanished. This is the life, the tragedy, and the forgotten legacy of Rodney Harvey. To truly understand the trajectory of a life like Rodney Harvey's, you have to transport yourself back in time to feel the specific gravity of the world that created him. The late 1980s in America were a period of profound contradiction. On the surface, it was the tail end of Reagan's Morning in America. The zeitgeist was still defined by Wall Street ambition, big hair, and vibrant, optimistic pop music. But underneath that glossy veneer, a deep cultural shift was rumbling. The unbridled consumerism of the decade had led to a spiritual hollowness, and a new generation was beginning to reject it. The 1987 stock market crash had shattered the myth of infinite prosperity. The AIDS epidemic was carving a path of terror and grief through creative communities, casting a long, dark shadow of mortality over a generation that had once felt invincible. In the cities, the gap between the rich and the poor was widening into a chasm. Out of this growing disillusionment, a new aesthetic was born. It was an aesthetic of authenticity, or at least what looked like authenticity. In fashion photography, the sun-kissed, muscular, all-American jock was being replaced by a different kind of ideal. Photographers like Bruce Weber, Herb Ritts, and Stephen Maisel began turning their lenses towards young men who were leaner, more angular, more androgynous. They had a languid, almost wounded beauty. They looked like poets, runaways, and artists. They looked like they had lived. This wasn't about selling an image of perfect health. It was about selling an image of profound feeling, of a soulfulness tinged with melancholy. It was a look that found beauty in imperfection, glamour in the grit. Simultaneously, American cinema was experiencing a renaissance. A new wave of independent directors, inspired by European art house and the renegade spirit of the 70s, was telling stories far from the blockbuster fantasies of Hollywood. Filmmakers like Gus Van Sant, Jim Jarmusch, and Spike Lee were focusing on the margins of society, on the outcasts, the dreamers, the hustlers. They were creating a cinematic landscape that was raw, personal, and unapologetically real. It was a world that needed new faces, actors who didn't look like they were manufactured in a studio, but like they had been plucked directly from the streets they were portraying. It was into this very specific cultural moment, a moment that craved a beautiful rebel, a wounded soul, an authentic face, that Rodney Harvey was about to emerge as if he'd been designed for the part. Born Rodney Michael Harvey on July 31st, 1967, his beginnings in Philadelphia were a universe away from the glamorous worlds he would later inhabit. His was not a childhood of stage schools and headshots. He was raised in South Philadelphia, a notoriously tough working-class neighborhood. Details of his early family life are sparse and often contradictory, a common trait for those who wish to leave a painful past behind. What is known is that it was unstable and difficult. He learned the hard lessons of survival early on, developing a street-smart toughness that would become a defining part of his persona. By his teenage years, he was largely on his own, navigating the world with a chip on his shoulder and a keen sense of self-preservation. This upbringing forged in him a compelling duality. On the one hand, he was guarded, wary, and possessed a quiet intensity that could be mistaken for aloofness. On the other hand, Those who knew him well spoke of a deep sensitivity, a gentle and almost boyish sweetness that lay just beneath the surface. It was this combination, the tough exterior protecting a fragile interior, that would make him so captivating. He wore his history in his eyes. His escape route appeared in a manner so cinematic, it feels like fiction. In the mid-1980s, like so many restless youths before him, he made his way to New York City. He wasn't there to become a star. He was simply surviving. But in the electric, chaotic landscape of 1980s downtown Manhattan, beauty like his didn't go unnoticed for long. The story goes that he was spotted by Paul Morrissey, the legendary director and key collaborator in Andy Warhol's factory. Morrissey had a famous eye for superstars, found not in casting offices, but on the street corners and in the dive bars of the city. He was drawn to people with an unvarnished, raw charisma, an it factor that couldn't be taught. In Rodney, he saw it in spades. Morrissey cast the 18-year-old Harvey in his 1985 film, Mixed Blood. The film was a gritty, violent, and often chaotic satire about rival drug gangs in New York's Alphabet City. Rodney played a small role as a young gang member named Jose. He's a peripheral character, but watching the film today, he's impossible to miss. Even in these early moments on screen, the camera loves him. He possesses a natural, unforced presence, a stark contrast to some of the more theatrical performances around him. He wasn't acting the part of a street kid. He was drawing from a life he knew intimately. The film itself was a cult item, not a mainstream hit, but it was his entry point. It put him on the map for a certain subset of casting directors, and more importantly, fashion industry scouts who were always on the hunt for the next new face. And what a face it was! It was a perfect synthesis of the era's emerging aesthetic. The strong masculine jawline and high cheekbones were offset by full, almost pouty lips and large, soulful eyes that held a hint of sadness. It was a face that could project both danger and vulnerability in a single glance. It didn't take long for the fashion world to come calling. He was signed by Ford Models, one of the top agencies in the world, and his ascent was nothing short of meteoric. He quickly became a favorite of the industry's most influential image makers. Bruce Weber, whose iconic black and white photography was defining a new American masculinity, photographed him extensively. In Weber's images, Rodney embodied a kind of dreamy, blue-collar romanticism. He could be seen lounging in a field in a plain white t-shirt or staring pensively from a fire escape, looking like a character straight out of a Steinbeck novel. His work for Calvin Klein's hugely influential campaign cemented his status. There, he was presented as the brooding sensual ideal, the very picture of rebellious youth. His image was everywhere. He graced the pages of Life magazine, Italian Vogue, L'Uomo Vogue, and countless others. He shot campaigns for Perry Ellis and appeared in catalogs for J. Crew, showcasing a versatility that allowed him to move between high fashion and commercial work. For a few years, Rodney Harvey was one of the most in-demand male models on the planet. The money poured in. He was able to leave the precariousness of his past behind, buying a home in Los Angeles and living a lifestyle that must have seemed like an impossible dream to the kid from South Philly. But the industry that celebrated his authenticity was also one steeped in excess. The parties, the constant travel, the pressure to maintain a certain look and lifestyle. It was a high-stakes world. For a young man whose formative years were marked by instability and trauma, this new world offered a whole new set of dangers. The temptations that had always lurked on the periphery of his life were now front and center, dressed up in glamour and readily available. The very realness that made him a star was intrinsically linked to the demons he was still trying to outrun. His success in modeling soon reopened the door to acting, and this time it would lead him to the project that would define his career, seal his fate, and intertwine his story forever with another of his generation's most beautiful and damned souls. By 1990, director Gus Van Sant was a rising star in the world of independent film. His previous features, Mala Noche and Drugstore Cowboy, had established him as a filmmaker with a unique poetic voice and a deep empathy for characters living on the fringes of society. He was now embarking on his most ambitious project yet, a script he had been developing for years titled My Own Private Idaho. It was a bold, unconventional film, part road movie, part Shakespearean drama, part heartbreaking character study. It was to tell the story of two young street hustlers in Portland, Oregon, Mike Waters, a narcoleptic, searching for his estranged mother, and Scott Favor, the rebellious son of the mayor, who was living a life of debauchery in a rejection of his privileged background. The roles of Mike and Scott were already cast with two of the most dynamic young actors in Hollywood, River Phoenix and Keanu Reeves. Van Sant now needed to build the world around them. He needed a supporting cast that felt utterly authentic, a crew of street kids who wouldn't seem like actors playing dress-up. He needed people who understood the rhythms and the heartbreaks of that life. Having seen his raw presence in Mixed Blood and his ubiquitous, soulful image in fashion campaigns, Van Sant saw Rodney Harvey as a perfect fit. Rodney was cast as Gary, a fellow hustler and a member of the makeshift family of street kids who gravitate around the Falstaffian figure of Bob Pigeon. It wasn't a leading role, but it was a pivotal one. Gary is part of the film's emotional core, a constant presence in the scenes, set in the abandoned Sovereign Hotel, the squat that serves as the group's dilapidated kingdom. In these scenes, Van Sant fostered an environment of improvisation and collaboration. He wanted the actors to bring their own experiences and personalities to their roles, to blur the lines between character and self. For Rodney, this was more than just an acting technique. It was a reflection of a life he knew. The camaraderie, the shared vulnerability, the gallows humor. It all resonated with his own past. He formed an immediate and powerful bond with the rest of the cast, particularly with River Phoenix. On the surface, they might have seemed different. River, the sensitive vegan from a famously unconventional family of performers. Rodney, the tough kid from the streets of Philadelphia. But they recognized something in each other. Both were outsiders in the polished world of Hollywood. Both possessed a deep well of emotion just beneath a carefully constructed exterior. And both, tragically, were dancing with the same dark temptations. The set of My Own Private Idaho became a legendary bubble of creativity and camaraderie. Keanu Reeves, already a star but known for his kindness and professionalism, acted as a grounding force. Flea, of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, brought a manic energy. But the magnetic center was the friendship between River and Rodney. They were often inseparable, sharing a quiet understanding. Van Sant himself would later speak of the palpable connection between them, a gentleness and mutual respect that translated both on and off the screen. This blurring of lines is most evident in the film's iconic campfire scene. In it, the characters gather around a fire and share deeply personal stories. Van Sant encouraged the actors to improvise, to tell stories that were true to them. It's a moment of stunning intimacy. As you watch Rodney in that scene, listening to the others, a quiet, pensive look on his face, it feels less like a performance and more like a documentary moment. He's not just playing a character, he's a young man reflecting, surrounded by a tribe he has found. However, a darker reality permeated the production. The film's depiction of drug use was not always fictionalized. The world of street hustlers in the late 80s and early 90s was deeply enmeshed with heroin, and in the name of authenticity, that reality bled onto the set. Gus Van Sant has since confirmed that some of the drug use seen in the film was real. For actors like River and Rodney, who were already experimenting, this environment was not a safe space. It was a place where their personal struggles and their professional work dangerously converged. The film they were making was a beautiful, poetic exploration of broken lives, but for some of them, the brokenness was not an act. When My Own Private Idaho was released in the fall of 1991, it was met with near universal critical acclaim. It was hailed as a landmark of the new queer cinema and a masterpiece of independent filmmaking. River Phoenix's performance was lauded as transcendent, earning him the Best Actor award at the Venice Film Festival and cementing his status as the most gifted actor of his generation. The film became an instant cult classic, a touchstone for a generation of young people who felt unseen by mainstream Hollywood. For Rodney Harvey, it should have been the moment his career exploded. He had proven he was more than just a pretty face. He had held his own in a cast of phenomenal talent, in a film that was being talked about everywhere. His performance, while small, was noted for its quiet realism. He was now a part of cinematic history. The future should have been a wide-open road, but instead, the release of this beautiful, tragic film marked the beginning of his own tragic end. The very authenticity that had made him so perfect for the role was about to consume him whole. The period immediately following the success of My Own Private Idaho should have been a victory lap for Rodney Harvey. He had critical acclaim, industry recognition, and the kind of edgy credibility that casting directors love. But the seductive pull of addiction is cruelly indifferent to career momentum. The drug use that had been a part of the scene, a shadow that followed him from the streets to the fashion shoots to the film set, now moved to the center of his life. Heroin, with its promise of euphoric oblivion, took firm root. His professional life began to disintegrate with alarming speed. The subtle codes of Hollywood, punctuality, reliability, returning calls, were the first casualties. Agents and managers grew frustrated. Auditions were missed. Meetings were blown off. He developed a reputation for being unreliable, a fatal label in an industry built on multi-million-dollar schedules. The offers that had surely been coming his way began to slow, and then they stopped. The light that had shone so brightly on him was now being deliberately directed elsewhere. He was becoming a risk, a liability. His personal life was in a similar state of collapse. Friendships became strained. The circle of people around him began to shrink, divided between those who enabled his addiction and those who were pushed away by the chaos it created. He was isolating himself, drifting deeper into a world where the only priority was the next high. Then on October 31st, 1993, the unthinkable happened. Outside the Viper Room on Hollywood's Sunset Strip, River Phoenix collapsed from a massive drug overdose. He died in the arms of his brother and sister on a cold patch of sidewalk. He was 23 years old. The news was a seismic shock. It was not just the death of a movie star, it felt like the death of a promise, the loss of a generation's brightest light. The entire community of young Hollywood was plunged into a state of grief and terror. For Rodney Harvey, the death of his close friend was an incomparable devastation. He had lost his kindred spirit, the one person who perhaps truly understood the battles he was fighting. It was a loss that would have broken even the strongest person. One would hope that such a horrific, close-to-home tragedy would serve as the ultimate wake-up call, a terrifying glimpse at the end of the path he was on. For many in their social circle it was. The party for a moment was over. The glamour of drug use was stripped bare, revealing the ugly, fatal reality beneath. But for Rodney, it had the opposite effect. He didn't run from the fire. He ran deeper into it. The grief was too immense, the pain too raw. Drugs were not the problem. They were his perceived solution, his only way to numb the agony. He spiraled. His addiction, already severe, now became all-consuming. If he had been walking a tightrope before, he was now in a freefall, and the last safety net had just been ripped away. The years that followed were a slow, heartbreaking descent into the inferno. With his career in ashes, his primary source of income was gone. His life became a desperate scramble to fund a habit that demanded everything from him. This led him into a life of petty crime. The name that once appeared in the credits of fashion magazines now appeared on police blotters. He was arrested multiple times in both Los Angeles and New York. The charges were tragically predictable: burglary, theft, larceny. He was stealing from stores, breaking into homes, not out of malice, but out of the desperate, singular focus of a full-blown addict. He became a revolving door resident of the country's most notorious jails, Los Angeles County Jail and the infamous Rikers Island in New York. These institutions were, and are, brutally ill-equipped to handle addiction. They offered punishment, not treatment. Each stint behind bars would force him into sobriety, but upon his release, with no money, no support system, and no prospects, he would be thrown right back into the same desperate circumstances that fueled his addiction in the first place. There's a particularly poignant detail from this period that illustrates the depth of his fall. In Italy, where his modeling work had made him a recognizable star, he was once arrested for stealing from a Versace store. The irony is devastating. The very world of high fashion that had built him up was now a world he was looting from, a ghost raiding the ruins of his own past. He was no longer a part of that world. He was on the outside, looking in through a shattered window. The handsome, charismatic young man was gone, replaced by a gaunt, haunted figure. He had lost everything: his career, his fortune, his friends, and his future. The industry that had so eagerly profited from his image of a beautiful rebel had completely abandoned him now that the rebellion had turned into a real, messy, and unprofitable disease. He was a stark reminder of what could go wrong, and Hollywood has never had much tolerance for such reminders. He was forgotten, erased from the narrative, a ghost haunting the city of dreams. The final chapter of Rodney Harvey's life is a study in loneliness and despair. After his last release from prison, he was untethered, floating through the underbelly of Los Angeles. He was homeless, often staying in squalid, pay-by-the-hour motels or crashing on the floors of acquaintances who hadn't yet shut the door on him. He was a phantom, a whisper of a memory in a town with no memory. Those who encountered him in these final years described a man who was a shadow of his former self. The physical toll of years of heroin abuse was stark. He was painfully thin, his once luminous face now gaunt and marked by the hardships of his life. Yet beneath the devastation of addiction, many said the gentle, kind-hearted person was still there. He was described as sweet, soft-spoken, and painfully aware of the paradise he had lost. This is perhaps the greatest cruelty of addiction. The addict is often the most astute observer of their own destruction, a prisoner inside a body they can no longer control. On April 10, 1998, in a room at the Hotel Barbizon in Los Angeles, Rodney Harvey's long struggle came to an end. It was a once respectable establishment that had fallen into disrepair, A transient hotel where lives were lived in the margins week by week, day by day. Its faded carpets and peeling wallpaper had absorbed 1,000 stories of quiet desperation, making it a fitting and heartbreaking final backdrop for Rodney's own life. The hotel stood as a silent, crumbling metaphor for the promise he once held. He was found dead by a hotel employee, a detail that feels so stark and impersonal, it's almost cruel. There was no frantic call from a loved one, no discovery by a concerned friend. It was likely a housekeeper knocking on a door that wouldn't open, using a master key to enter a room that had been paid for in cash. One can only imagine that quiet, sterile moment of discovery. The drawn curtains, the stillness in the air, the silent figure of a man who had once been the beautiful face of a generation, now just another anonymous tragedy in a city full of them. The cause of death, later determined by the coroner, was a multiple drug overdose of heroin and cocaine, a combination sometimes known on the street as a speedball. He was 30 years old. His death was met with a deafening silence. There were no front-page headlines, no tearful televised tributes. It was a small blurb in the back page's news item, reported by Variety and a few other trade papers, as the sad but unsurprising end of a former model and actor. In the grand narrative of Hollywood, it was a non-event. The industry that had once clamored for his face had long since learned to look away. His descent hadn't been a sudden, shocking plummet. It had been a slow, public, and painful erosion over many years. And in the cruel calculus of celebrity, a slow burn rarely ignites a firestorm of public grief. The shock had worn off long ago, replaced by a resigned sadness among the few who still remembered him. He had fallen so far from the spotlight that his death barely registered as a flicker. It's impossible not to contrast this silence with the media explosion that had followed the death of River Phoenix. River's passing was a global event, a sudden, tragic loss that felt like a betrayal of fate. It was shocking. Rodney's death, on the other hand, was seen by the few who noted it as an inevitability. He was a ghost long before he died, and the world rarely mourns a ghost. 4.5 years after the world had mourned the loss of River, Rodney Harvey, his friend and fellow soldier in a lost war, died essentially alone, his passing noted by almost no one. There was no star-studded memorial, no public eulogy from the famous friends of his past. He had simply faded to black, leaving behind a legacy so faint it was almost invisible. The story of Rodney Harvey is not just a personal tragedy. It's an indictment of a culture and an era. The controversy surrounding his life and death is complex, forcing us to look beyond the simple narrative of an addict who made bad choices. It demands we ask more difficult questions about the systems that build up and then discard beautiful young people. The legacy of Rodney Harvey is a quiet one, but it is deeply significant. He is not remembered as a cinematic legend like his friend River. He does not have a cult following that keeps his memory alive. His legacy is more subtle and in many ways more harrowing. He stands as a haunting symbol of the forgotten casualties, the human collateral of a specific and brutal cultural moment. To remember Rodney Harvey is to choose to look into the shadows, to acknowledge the stories that are easier to ignore. It's to see him not as a failure or a junkie, but as a sensitive, talented young man who was lost in a world that was too big, too fast, and too cruel. His life was a brief, beautiful, and heartbreaking flash in the pan. But for those who take the time to look, the light from that flash, however faint, still remains. A haunting reminder of the devastating cost of a dream and of the boy the world almost knew